This is part 2 of the post-World War II theological landscape. In this section, I'm going to look at the prophetic critique of the Sanhedrin. In the last section, I looked at how the evangelical world had linked itself to Calvinism, and some of the key figures in that, Jim Packer, who had brought Calvinism over from England, settled at Regent College in the late 1970s, so you get the bringing together of English Puritan Calvinism, and then North American forms of Calvinism through Carl Henry, Billy Graham, Charles Colson, Francis Schaeffer. There are many others. In this section, I want to look at the prophetic critique of that Sanhedrin, and there's two directions that can go. One theological, the other political. I'll start first with the political. In the by the 1950s, there emerged very clearly in the United States, obviously, injustices. The first that emerged was the treatment of the blacks in the civil rights movement. Billy Graham tended at that time to identify himself with the Republican position, and there became an obvious break between a Baptist tradition, which was Republican and tried to more or less stifle the injustices that were going on, and the emergence of a Martin Luther King Jr., who was very vocal and obviously at the center of saying something was wrong in Christendom, that one would link authentic Christianity with the interests of the powerful white people. And so by the 1950s, you are beginning to get a critique of that, a synthesis of Calvinism and Republicanism, and it comes from the black tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. and many other black Baptists. 1960s also, with the Vietnam War, and as it accelerated, many evangelicals who had grown up within a Calvinist heritage, in fact had attended many evangelical Calvinist seminaries, began to ask the question, can we necessarily link authentic faith when we read the Beatitudes, or we read Matthew 25, or we read the prophetic tradition coming out of the Hebrew canon? Is it right, if we take the Bible as authority, as did the evangelicals and did the Calvinists, is there only one way to read it politically? Does the Bible equal American republicanism? Well, in the 1960s and 70s, there emerged a group of thinkers within the evangelical, the Mennonite tradition, and other forms of Christianity that argued, in thinking from that Hebrew prophetic tradition, the Beatitudes, Matthew, the early patristic tradition, the post-apostolic fathers, perhaps the most appropriate reading of the Bible is to focus not so much on justification by grace through faith, but to look at the justice and peacemaking element of it. And out of this emerges groups like Jim Wallis and Sojourners, Ron Sider, coming out in his case of Eastern College, the Mennonite tradition, Tom Sine, Tony Campolo is going to come later. And these particular thinkers are going to say, okay, we're with you on the authority of the Bible. We strongly disagree with your application of the Bible in terms of economic, military, social issues. So we're both on the same page in terms of the authority of the Bible, as was, for example, the Luther-Erasmus debate. The disagreement was over its interpretation and application. And this began to divide the Reformed and evangelical world in terms of the social, economic, military, political outworkings. The second would be the theological. People like Clark Pinnock come along in the 1980s and 1990s, drawing from other people like Donald Dayton and arguing, does evangelical necessarily equal Calvinists? So you get the holiness movement, you have the Pentecostal tradition, you have Wesley coming from high church Anglicanism. They certainly were not Calvinist. And so there's a whole reread then of the Bible in terms of human responsibility, human choice, human freedom, and God's grace. And how do these two work together in terms of a dance, a symphony, synergism in the Orthodox sense? And so out of people like Donald Dayton, Clark Pinnock, and many others, there's this decided critique of Calvinism is the only way of interpreting the authority of the Bible. And again, this theological exegetical critique does not come from a doubting of the authority of the Bible. It's a doubting of the interpretation of the Bible. And when the Calvinist tradition basically took position, they were the only authoritative read of the Bible. In one sense, this becomes almost a new, a papal position, and they just become the new popes. And so what we have then in terms of this prophetic critique of the Calvinist Sanhedrin comes from both a theological position, in which people like Donald Dayton, Clark Pinnock, and others are a part of, and a political prophetic critique, which we see people initially like the Martin Luther Kings, the Jim Wallis, the Ron Siders, the Tom Sines, the Tony Campolos are a part of that. And so the danger always is of saying evangelical equals Calvinist. Obviously, people critique that and say no, and then evangelical Calvinist equals Republican, and there's obviously a whole school of thinkers that say that's not true also. And so this is the prophetic critique of the Sanhedrin.